Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. Today you have me, Jen Gerson, and I am interviewing Barry Eichengreen, a professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. He is probably best known for his fairly seminal work, Golden Fetters, the Gold Standard, and the Great Depression. And what a perfect person to have on to be talking about what could become our very own Great Depression. That's this week on the Line. We also are going to have an update from our friends at Ipsos to talk about social cohesion. So as you can imagine, it's going to be a cheerful one. That's today on the Line.
This message is brought to you by Westinghouse. Canada's energy future is being shaped by the choices we make today. As demand for reliable, clean power grows, the need for proven solutions has never been more urgent. Nuclear energy is an essential part of the solution. Westinghouse's AP1000 reactor is the world's most advanced operational Generation 3+ reactor. Proven, safe, efficient, and ready now. It can be brought online within a decade, delivering clean, reliable power when we need it most. Building AP1000 plants can strengthen our electricity export capabilities and provide Canada's nuclear supply chain with access to 100% of the global market, all while minimizing the risks of building domestic nuclear energy generation on a single technology. Westinghouse is 100% Canadian owned and buys where it builds, working with over 450 Canadian suppliers to strengthen the domestic supply chain and bring benefits home to our nation. Canada needs energy. Westinghouse is ready. Learn more at westinghousenuclear.com/Canada.
Well, hello, Professor Eichengreen. Thank you so much for joining me from California.
Good to be with you. Good to be with my Canadian friends.
Excellent. Well, we're glad to have a few down south. I was just explaining to you off air, but I will explain it to you on air as well. Is that my poor husband, who did do a graduate level thesis and history and economics, cited you multiple times in his work. So he's extremely excited that I get to talk to you and a little bit jealous. So there we go. So the way that he described you was you were probably one of the go-to academics and thinkers to discuss economic crises. And that seems like a really applicable topic to get into at the current moment. So I really do appreciate that you had a little bit of time for us today. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Great. So obviously, I'm not going to tempt fate by giving our listeners the exact news of the moment. We're recording this at about 1 Mountain Standard Time, I believe noon your time in California, on Monday. So Lord knows what fresh hell will be unleashed upon us in the next 4 to 5 hours while the markets remain open. But we know that the economic news is not great. So, and hasn't been great for several days in the wake of Donald Trump's Liberation Day. So I'm kind of hoping that you might be able to explain to me and our listeners exactly how bad it is, and if we can provide some kind of historical context for the current drops in the market right now.
Well, to put it in technical economic terms, it's a disaster.
Okay.
President Trump has basically blown up the global trading order, forgetting the fact that companies in the United States, in Canada, and around the world are deeply integrated into global supply chains. They rely on foreign parts and components. They rely on foreign assembly plants. That's true for many important U.S. companies. It's true for many important Canadian companies, given that those foreign assembly plants and the ability to source inputs from abroad is now suddenly disrupted. The markets realize that firms are facing hard times, difficult adjustments. Their profits have been vaporized in the last week. So it's not surprising that stock markets are highly volatile and most of the volatility is on the downside.
So can you put this into historic context? Is this worse than 2008? Is this worse than COVID? Is this worse than, do we have to go back to 1929 to find a stock market collapse this dramatic?
I think it is worse than the global financial crisis, 2008. It's worse than COVID, partly because there is very little that the Fed and other central banks can do by stepping in and stabilizing the situation. I think the current situation may turn out to be worse than the early 1930s when the United States imposed the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Mm-hmm. The tariff rates that were announced last week are actually higher than those of the Smoot-Hawley Act. And President Trump shows no sign yet of rethinking anything that he's done. Rethinking may be the wrong word. I don't think he thought through clearly what he was doing in the first place, but he's showing no signs of backing down. So I'm worried about what is coming. The markets have only had 3 days to react, to begin to absorb what has happened, and they may continue to react negatively as the new reality sinks in.
Okay, so here's my question, because Donald Trump has been talking about tariffs for months now. So I realize that Liberation Day was the day when the hammer came down and no one could be in denial about it anymore. But why didn't the markets bake in some of the impacts of these tariffs months ago?
Because many influential figures in the markets did not believe Mr. Trump's campaign rhetoric. They did not believe he was really going to follow through with tariffs of this magnitude. They saw a few reasonable advisors around the president who it turns out were largely dealt out of the final decision about what to do. The people in the markets were happy with the Trump administration's deregulation agenda, with its attempt to downsize government, with its tax cut plans. So they disregarded what he said about tariffs, and that has come back to bite them now.
So I guess, oops?
This is a big oops, absolutely. And cosmic consequences for the U.S. and global economies can follow from a big oops.
Are there particular numbers or data that you are tracking that a normal person might not be tracking to indicate to you what the long-term impacts are? I'm thinking like the bond market or the futures market that really concerns you.
Well, I think people have been looking at the market in junk bonds, corporate bonds that are not high quality, that are not investment grade, because they're kind of a leading indicator of what's going to happen to corporate profits.
Okay.
That if important corporations are going to get into trouble, they're not going to be able to repay what they borrowed. And that is showing up already in corporate junk bond spreads. So that's one answer. And another one would be what happens to the dollar, U.S. dollar exchange rate? Because normally you would expect a tariff to strengthen the exchange rate, in this case of the United States, because a tariff switches U.S. spending toward domestic goods. We only produce so many domestic goods, so the currency has to strengthen to shift U.S. spending back toward, say, Canadian goods. But if the dollar, instead of strengthening, now weakens, that indicates that there's a real crisis of confidence in the U.S. administration, in the rule of law in the United States, about whether the U.S. is committed to cooperation with other countries. So,
which it pretty clearly isn't.
Yeah, and the dollar is now beginning to weaken. So
right.
People should keep an eye on the extent to which it continues to weaken. And this realization that the U.S. is no longer committed to the international economy and the global community of nations begins to sink in.
So one of the nightmare scenarios that I've heard play out at a very hypothetical sense is what happens if the US dollar, no longer is the global reserve currency? What happens to America in that circumstance? And one of the most terrifying scenarios that I've heard play out is if that is the case and there is a global collapse in confidence in the US dollar, what would wind up happening is enormous sums of US money essentially flood back into the domestic market, creating an inflation, if not a hyperinflation situation. Is that a plausible nightmare scenario, or am I spending too much time on YouTube?
So I don't think there will be hyperinflation in the United States or even another major inflation because the Fed can address that problem. The Fed now faces two potential problems. One is inflation in the U.S. mainly because tariffs are inflationary. They will push up the prices of imports,
Okay.
and the Fed can raise interest rates to counter that. The other problem the Fed faces is a big negative supply shock, that global supply chains have been disrupted. The ability of firms to produce goods and services has been hit, and monetary policy. The Fed cannot do anything about that second problem. The implication of the dollar losing its international and reserve currency status, I think, is a little different from what you said. It's that the global economy runs on liquidity. Finance liquidity is the grease in the wheels of international trade and international investment. So international payments tend to go through the U.S. dollar and the U.S. banking system, even when they're payments between Canada and Slovakia. Canadian banks find a correspondent in the U.S. to make that payment to or from Slovakia. And if the dollar is no longer trusted, all of a sudden those circuits have been interrupted, and international transactions of all kind are at risk, begin to collapse. That's what we saw in the 1930s. There was flight away from the U.S. dollar because of three big banking crises in the U.S., because the dollar was already being widely used internationally at that time. All of a sudden, with loss of confidence in the greenback, there wasn't enough liquidity to support global trade and payments, and they collapsed in the Great Depression. That's the worry now, in my view.
So if that kind of scenario where that happens, and those types of global payments start to collapse, and America ceases to be the U.S. reserve currency, is it possible that America ceases to be able to essentially print its way out of its spending problems as well, right? Because isn't one of the ways that America manages to buttress its I mean, we know that its deficits are routinely in the trillions of dollars. One of the ways it's able to do that is essentially it controls literally the global printing, the money printing machines, essentially. And it's a primitive way of putting it, but does it challenge America's ability to fundamentally play financial games in order to further its spending?
All that's correct, but I want to preface my answer.
Oh, God, thank God it is, because I wasn't sure at all as I was speaking. The words were coming out of my mouth and I was guessing.
It won't happen overnight if it happens. So I think the changes in the international role of the dollar will develop over time. If confidence in the dollar is lost, it won't happen this week. But because the dollar is the leading global currency, the U.S. government is able to borrow at a lower cost than it would otherwise. That's a more
technically correct,
rigorous, technical, economic way of saying what you just said.
Okay, good. Thank you for saving me there. I appreciate it. I could see myself drowning as I was saying it, so I appreciate the
dollar is viewed as a safe haven. People rush into the dollar whenever a bad thing happens. So when Lehman Brothers failed in 2008, people rushed into the dollar, and that prevented our exchange rate from collapsing or our interest rates from skyrocketing. When COVID broke out in March of 2020, same thing happened. So if people lose confidence in the dollar, if it's no longer regarded as a safe haven, we'll no longer have that automatic form of insurance that protection against interest rate spikes and currency collapses when a bad thing happens. So there could be profound negative consequences for the U.S. currency, as well as the U.S. economy, because of these disruptions to trade that we were talking about a few minutes ago.
So are we seeing, as a result of the crisis on the stock markets, that people are moving into treasury bonds, for example? Is there indication that might create ballast for the collapse in the markets?
Well, what we've seen is that interest rates on treasuries have gone down, which means their prices have gone up. So there are two interpretations of that. One is people are moving into treasuries as a safe haven still, and that's pushing up their price. But the other one is that people have drastically increased the probability they attach to a recession in the United States. And if they expect a recession, they expect lower interest rates. The Fed will cut rates. Investment demand will be lower. Interest rates will fall. And so the lower interest rates on treasuries could be a good thing. If treasuries are still a safe haven, it could be a bad thing if what they reflect are expectations of recession. I kind of suspect there's a little bit of both.
There are other places that people can store money during times of uncertainty. Gold is obviously the obvious one, and you've written quite extensively about gold in the past. Increasingly now, many, particularly young people, think that Bitcoin and other types of cryptocurrencies could be a safer place to park their assets in a era of increasing uncertainty. Is there anything that we're seeing on the gold or the Bitcoin side that would indicate to you that there's a bit of a retreat from treasuries or an opportunity for those types of asset classes to become more lucrative?
I have been so busy trying to absorb the news on the tariff front and the stock market front. I haven't looked at gold or Bitcoin, but I can still tell you what I think, that gold has traditionally been a safe haven in circumstances like those we've been going through. So it's probably a good bet that gold prices will remain strong. The worry about cryptocurrencies, whether they are Bitcoin or stable coins like Tether or something like that. Bitcoin is very volatile. It has what finance folks call a high beta. So if the stock market oscillates, Bitcoin prices will oscillate even more in both directions. So there's a real chance that people who buy Bitcoin, especially on margin, putting only a portion of the purchase price down, could get hit if the market moves the wrong way in a day, which under the current circumstances can happen. And these are exactly the kind of circumstances where a stable coin like Tether, it could break. It has broken from its par of 1 Tether equals $1 before. And if people decide they want to withdraw their Tether, convert their Tether into actual currency in large numbers, it could break again. So
it kind of becomes a modern version of a run on commercial banks.
I think of a run on stable coins like Tether as exactly the same thing as a traditional run on banks. So your economic intuition is good again.
Okay, good. Thank God. Being married to my husband is really paying off, let me tell you. So, I mean, the other interesting thing is the cryptocurrency stuff is really fascinating, because I'm wondering if it could have the same kind of effect on the overall market that, for example, run on commercial banks had in the 30s, where it just sort of adds a degree of volatility, adds a degree of sort of currency uncertainty to the entire overall system.
Yeah, even before the events of the last week, people, and I include myself, have become more worried about how events in the crypto sphere could spill over into the traditional banking and financial system through two channels. Number one, big institutional investors, investment banks, and others are holding more crypto. So if crypto prices were to suddenly go down, that could threaten them directly. And secondly, stable coins like Tether are collateralized mainly the backing they hold is mainly U.S. Treasury bonds.
Oh.
So people
Oops.
cash in their tether. Tether in turn has to sell Treasury bonds, and you get more volatility in that market as well.
Oh, interesting. So like the possibility of some kind of domino effect as a result of this particular collapse is real then. And it could domino out in ways that we can't even predict right now.
Yeah, that's why many of us had been really worried about how the Trump administration had been promoting crypto, because it was
Right.
promoting the development of these links.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Love that for us. Okay, so here's my other question here is that I know that when I publish this, my Twitter feed or my X feed is going to be filled with a lot of people who are very convinced that Donald 5D Chess Trump actually knows what he's doing, and this is just a stock market blip. The manufacturing is going to come back after all of this, and also the stock market, like birds, isn't really real. Nobody really cares what a bunch of rich people invested in the stock market. That's not the real economy. Those types of arguments are going to become prevalent. That in fact, what this is just going to be short-term temporary pain, and once everything gets back onshore again, America is going to be great again. I mean, granted, you're a professor, so your opinion here can't be remotely trusted, and I'm, a mainstream media elite hack. But is there any validity to that argument? Is there any possibility here that what we're experiencing is short-term crisis that is going to rectify a lot of the excesses of global capitalism in the long run?
So the stock market is not the economy. You correctly made that point, and the real economy and the stock market have diverged for limited periods, many times in the past. However, podcasters, professors, market participants are kind of trained to look for a logic in the actions and decisions taken by our leaders, by our governments, and I believe that is a mistake in the present instance, that Mr. Trump does not have a logic behind his belief in tariffs, which seems to be some kind of religious faith in their beauty. And we've heard in the last few days multiple rationales coming from the administration about the problem that tariffs will solve. None of them make sense to an economist. And I think the markets are reacting negatively to this realization, which is finally sinking in, that Mr. Trump believes in tariffs, and he does not have any clear rationale behind that belief. That's what makes me worry that the volatility and the decline in the stock market that we've seen so far may continue. The other thing we've learned is that we're now seeing Trump unbound, or Trump unleashed, that he cares much less, if at all, about what the stock market or other thought leaders or the Congress or the courts think about his actions. So what he has done in terms of tariffs, disregarding international institutions, the World Trade Organization, bilateral trade agreements with different countries, is of a piece with what he's done in disregarding U.S. laws regarding deportation and federal government spending programs and the like. He seems to do what he pleases, and there's no one yet in a position to restrain him. So again, I think that's reason for worrying that the negative market reaction we've seen so far is likely to continue for a while.
When we had the global financial crisis, I recall that there was a years-long conversation about what we did wrong as a society, what the banking institutions did wrong in order to create that much unseen risk within the system leading to that collapse. Is there a similar conversation that we're going to have that, like, one dude with religious views about tariff gets into the wrong position of power and kablooey, it all goes to hell? I mean, how do we protect against that in the future?
Well, I think that conversation has already begun, but it's a different flavor of conversation from what happened during and after the global financial crisis. So then it was a conversation about what the flaws in the banking and financial system were and how to fix them. Now it has to be a conversation of what the flaws in the political system are. The U.S. economy was healthy coming into this year. Unemployment of 4%, inflation converging down to 2%. No fundamental problems in the economy, except we allowed ourselves to recklessly elect an irresponsible leader who's now wreaked havoc with the economy. What do we have to do to strengthen the separation of powers, fix dysfunctional political discussion in the United States? That's what somehow needs to be done to prevent this kind of thing from happening again.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation because I tend to think that even if Donald Trump were to see the light and be like, you know what, maybe collapsing the global economy wasn't the best idea, and he were to change his mind tomorrow and we all go back to normal, by the middle of May, I think some damage has been done. Like, I think that institutional damage and trust between countries I don't think that that's going to be something that can just be whisked away because Donald Trump changes his mind. I mean, here I am sitting in Canada. We've got Mark Carney is running for election, basically saying that the damage that you've done to the relationship that underlies the economic integration can't just be remedied at this point. So, even if we do have a situation where Donald Trump and his advisors change their mind, they just say, look, we can't continue to risk this much volatility in the economy. Do you think that they can flip a switch back? Do you think that they could get us back to where we were 2 weeks ago if they were to change their mind?
No, I agree with you. I think permanent damage has been done. And countries like Canada, which were deeply integrated economically with their big neighbor to the south, are going to look for new ways to hedge their bets, to make themselves less dependent on an unreliable United States. Unless something fundamental changes, there will be a non-zero probability of the U.S. electing someone who patterns himself after Trump in
success begets success,
2028,
right?
And you can guess the initials of such a person who would be likely to, if not follow the same policies, follow policies that were equally antagonistic toward foreign countries. So you heard Mr. Vance on Signal the other week talking about our European allies. Our European allies are not going to be willing to rely as heavily on the transatlantic alliance in the future as they did in the past, no doubt. So I think this is really kind of a fundamental sea change. It's the end of clearly the end of the post-World War II global order or post-World War II Western alliance. But what comes next, it's way too early to know.
Yeah. What does come next? So speaking from Canada, hi, nice to have you here, and please stop hurting us. We're nice.
It's tempting to say, can I get a passport? But that's a conversation for another day.
That may be a conversation we have another day. Like, when we're not recording, let's have that chat. Let's have that chat. Let's just say I'm the Prime Minister of Canada. I'm calling you up. I'm asking for advice. What the hell do we do? Because of course, much smaller economy, very dependent on the United States, increasingly dependent or not dependent on a unreliable partner, working the global economy. Our dollar has its own issues, and our own sort of internal economy and governance has its own challenges that we have to deal with as well. What do we do? Like, do we just start ripping through the money machine and printing it off now? Do we restrain spending? Like, what can we do to help insulate ourselves from the shock of all this?
Well, as I said about the Fed, what I said about the Fed earlier applies to the Bank of Canada as well. It's between a rock and a hard place. It's going to be seeing more inflation, which means raise interest rates, and a negative supply shock, recessionary tendencies, which mean reduce interest rates. So it's not going to have much leeway to move in either direction. I think, therefore, you're going to have to rely on government spending, fiscal policy, rather than central bank to help to stabilize the economy. So that means spending more now, bigger deficits now, and a plan for eliminating those deficits.
Well, that's always the challenge, isn't it? It's the eliminating the deficits on the other side.
Everybody's big challenge. Beyond that, I would say continue dealing with the United States the way the Canadian government has been dealing with the United States, which means be firm, don't give in to unreasonable demands, but don't provoke Mr. Trump into escalating what he's doing. So that's the stance the government has taken, and it should maintain that.
So that's a really, really fine line for a Canadian.
Yeah, so I mentioned before how the difficult fine line the Bank of Canada would have to walk the government as well, and begin talking more to your partners outside North America about deepening your economic and financial and political ties.
Is there anything obvious that, from where you're standing, that we should be doing that we're not doing or not seeing?
Not that I can see, really. Everything that I mentioned before, I think, is being done. It's too early to know what to do in terms of fiscal policy. It's too early for Canada to have had that discussion yet. It takes more than a week to decide what to do with the budget. But the Bank of Canada has been appropriately cautious because of these cross currents that it faces. And I think the government has taken the right stance toward the U.S. and signaled pretty clearly it's willing to talk to the U.K. and to the Europeans and so forth.
So my concern is, when Canada, we came out of COVID with very significant deficits that we weren't able to, we reined them back a little bit, but not nearly as much as we ought to have. And my concern is that Canada's fiscal capacity to handle another major crisis is really limited. The cupboard wasn't exactly stocked before COVID. We definitely went into significant deficit and debt in order to try and manage that crisis. If we have another situation where we have to start mailing out checks to individual citizens to get through the day, I think we're in some deep poop. What do you think we can be doing here? Or do you think that the answer is keep the powder dry until we see how bad this gets?
I think, as I said, it's early days still. We're less than a week into this. So yes, for some more weeks, Canada should keep its powder dry, and we can see whether the situation continues to deteriorate. What you said about having less fiscal capacity than the country had in 2020 or in 2008, that's true of Canada, that's true of the U.S., and that's true of everybody, which is why, another reason, I think, why so many people are so deeply worried about the prospects. The ability to issue bonds and to run deficits is a valuable instrument in all-hands-on-deck emergency. And the problem we have is those emergencies have been coming fast
and furious,
and more frequently than ever before. I think this could really be the big one. In other words, COVID was bad, but the economy, in the U.S. case, when COVID broke out, unemployment immediately went up to 14%. But then, in response to adjustments and monetary and fiscal stimulus, it came right back down. This time, unemployment could stay high for quite a long time if these disruptions associated with tariffs and trade are not resolved. So I do worry that fiscal space is less than in the past, but the need for it is greater. And I keep referring to the rock and the hard place. Here are another couple of them.
Is this also a moment for a country like Canada to perhaps be opening the door for the things that make America economically viable and powerful? Like, hey, if you're a small company in Silicon Valley and are like, yeah, we're out, come to Canada, we'll give you tax breaks. Come to Canada, we'll give you a great immigration package. Or, if you're a professor, for example, and you're looking around and saying, yeah, I don't think so. Guess what? We're going to build 3 new universities and we're going to become an international university hub for the best talent fleeing America. Like, are there kind of big picture things that we could be thinking about in this particular environment?
Yes, there are. It saddens me, but I think what you said is exactly right, that one already hears rumblings about U.S. scientists and scholars. The rumblings I hear are look to Europe for a place where your academic freedom will be respected and maintained, and there will be a reliable funding model for your research and so forth. But both scientists working in the corporate sector and academics working in universities are going to be looking around, no doubt. And
so there's some really powerful economic opportunities here if Canada is able to be ruthless enough about poaching talent and capital.
Yeah, so I'm reminded about how the University of California, Berkeley, where I work, built its excellence after World War II by importing large numbers of great European scholars who left Germany and Austria and wherever. So it would, as I said, sadden me to see this operate in reverse, but it may.
Well, the weather's not as good, but we've got great views. Well, I think that's pretty much all of my questions, unless there's something I'm forgetting to ask, Professor.
No, I think I'm apologize if I couldn't be more optimistic. Here we are.
Well, don't worry about that. We at The Line are known for bringing the optimism, which is a joke you won't get. But no, we're not. We're known for being a little dour, But we're very nice people, and we try to be cheerful in our delivery. So we got that going for us. But anyway, thank you so much, Professor Eichengreen, for joining me today. We really appreciate your time, and I really also appreciate the historical context that you're able to put some of this in. I think that sometimes it's very easy for people to look at the stock market and say, well, it's down 5%. What does that mean, really? And the answer is it's a lot. That's actually pretty significant. And there are real-world economic impacts as a result of those kinds of fluctuations that people will almost certainly be feeling in their day-to-day lives in short order. So thank you for letting us contextualize that together, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
This message is brought to you by the Métis Nation of Ontario. Sault Ste. Marie, 2025. In a quiet room filled with maps, parish records, and the voices of history, a story long denied is finally told. For far too long, Métis communities in Ontario had been questioned, overlooked, and denied. After reviewing more than 50,000 pages of evidence, visiting the 7 historic Métis communities in Ontario, and hearing from 160 Métis Nation elders, youth, scholars, and leaders, the truth is clear. The Métis National Council's expert panel is the most comprehensive, transparent, and objective study ever conducted on Métis Nation communities in Ontario. The report rejected politically motivated misinformation, and it confirmed that the 7 historic Métis communities in Northern Ontario are, and have always been, part of the larger Métis Nation and meet the national definition of Métis. For the Métis Nation of Ontario and their citizens, this report was a vindication. To learn more, go to OntarioMétisFacts.com.
Joining me today here on the Line is Mike College. Mike, you are the president of ESG at Ipsos. Ipsos has been working with the Line throughout this election to sort of take a quick snapshot of not only just the top line polling figures, but also we like to dig underneath the surface a little bit and think about what's happening in the country politically and socially and culturally as well. And you guys had a really fascinating blip that you added to this Friday's Bullshit Bulletin about social cohesion. This is something that you guys have been tracking for some time, and it's something that I've written about in the past. But for people who may not be aware, Mike, can you explain to us what exactly you mean by social cohesion?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So social cohesion, it's really that glue that holds us together as a country. That do we feel like we think like our neighbors? Do we share common values? Do we support laws and norms? Do we think governments work for us? All of those things that bundle together to make us feel like, we're all in this together. And as you said, we've been tracking it for a while. And despite pandemics and other crises, it's been a long time since we can say a majority of us have felt like we're all in this together. It's been down for a number of reasons. What we've seen lately is a little bit of a bump over, basically since the inauguration of Mr. Trump.
So this was really interesting because I remember writing about this a couple of years ago. It seemed like COVID in particular, a collapse in social cohesion happened prior to COVID, but COVID really catalyzed it. Is that safe to say that that's been the trend in the last couple of years?
It had come down, and I think it had come down because social media, diverse media, a whole range of things, political tactics,
blame
wedge
us,
issues.
will you? My God.
Death by a thousand cuts, yeah. And then COVID hit, and, we had a lot of discussion around COVID. Will we come out of it with a K-shaped economy or a K-shaped recovery? And we came out of it with a K-shaped economy where the rich got richer, those with assets, those with homes tended to do well, pensions tended to do well, and the others didn't. And so the gap got wider. COVID was a real gap widening exercise between men and women, between newcomers and sort of Canadians who've been here longer, between generations. And that sort of exasperated this feeling of social cohesion that, when others started to do well, we looked around and said, look, it's not working for me. And I know my colleague Greg was on last week talking about some of the generational breaks, and that's really reflected in this as well.
So how do we understand this data in the context of politics and how it's functioned in Canada to date? And how do we understand it in the context of what's happening in the election today?
Well, I think what it does is, and in a lot of data points, this is the oversized impact. The most influential person in the Canadian election today is Donald Trump, because almost all of the rise in social cohesion, which aligns with the rise in sort of pride in Canada, has been in opposition to Donald Trump, right? We felt that the discussion around tariffs is a costly nuisance, but the discussion around annexation, 51st state, is an insult. So we've been hurt, our pride, we've been made angry, and so we're responding to that. And even that, we're not back to where we were pre-COVID in terms of those levels of social cohesion, but it's mostly pushed back on that, as opposed to a unification towards something. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there's a difference in social cohesion in terms of its internal stability, depending on whether or not it's a cohesion that's happening in response to a threat versus a cohesion that's getting people on board toward a common mission.
Yeah, because the threat can go away, right? There's a chance that we sign a new trade deal, and tempers calm down, and Mr. Trump backs off, and suddenly we're back into post-Trump, like we were post-COVID, and
back now we hate each other again, and it'll be great.
Yeah, does social cohesion hold together?
Right.
Do we stay up? Do we, can we find ways, and I hope we can, find ways to move it from being in opposition to Trump to being a unification and social cohesion around Canada, right? It's crucial that we have social cohesion in the country in order for plurality decisions to get made, right? If everything's a majority, it's very hard to find majority support for everything, right? We can find majority acceptance and plurality support. So you think about things like, I know you're sitting in Calgary, think about things like oil pipelines, think about energy corridors, think about the Ring of Circle and the development in Northern Ontario. Those things aren't going to be supported by everybody because of the regional variations, because of a whole range of things. But if we're all in this together, we sort of go, well, we accept the need to do these things for the country. And there's a whole range of things that we've done in the past, right? You could argue that, bilingualism is accepted by the rest of the country because it's the right thing to do to keep the country together, even though it doesn't necessarily impact people outside of Quebec as much as it does, obviously, Quebecers. And a range of things. A lot of our social programs serve the plurality of the population. At a time we did those in the 50s, 60s, where we had high social cohesion, and people were like, that makes sense for everybody that we look after these segment or these smaller groups.
So are there any gaps in social cohesion that you can tell from the data that you've collected? Are there groups of people, either geographically or demographically, that aren't coming together in the face of the Trump situation?
Well, it goes back to the conversation that Matt and Greg had last week. It's right now generationally, right? So the people who are lined up and are showing more social cohesion and always have been are baby boomers. They're the ones who Canada has worked the best for. They're the ones who can look back on the history of growth, on stability, on safety, on strong support systems, social systems, and say Canada's worked well for me, and I want to see it. I want to see it maintained to a certain extent. The groups it's not working for are younger generations, although they're tend to be a little more optimistic because they have a longer runway. And then you have middle generations who are squeezed by aging parents looking after children and not as long a runway in order to see their own realization of things like retirement, gains in capital wealth. And so they're struggling too. But it's broader than economics, right? We track a question on support for diversity, not support for immigration, but is diversity a good thing in the country? And for years, it hovered around 81, 82, maybe high 70s. And over the last year, it dropped about 10 points down to 68%. So it's still a majority who say that diversity is good for the country, but it's down 10, 12 points over its norm. That's come back up 5 or 6 points just in the last month, in large part because we've looked at ourselves, and this is a good thing, and said, oh, we don't like what we're hearing from Mr. Trump and the idea of the United States. So let's sort of reevaluate what we like about Canada. We do like multiculturalism, right? Doesn't work for everybody, and there's been challenges, et cetera, but we do generally think it's good. So we're trying to see that. The key is, can we make those things continue to grow and hold?
So is it possible that Trump may actually in some ways be a bit of a blessing in disguise in terms of getting Canada in over some of the funk that we've been in since COVID in particular, and actually get us start thinking beyond just Trump the threat, but start getting us thinking of, well, what does it mean? If we're not going to be American, what are we going to be then?
Yeah, he's certainly raised our interest in thinking about these things. He certainly made us focus on the things that we found valuable in the country. He certainly made us think about our future more. The question will be, when he downs tools, will we continue to sort of channel that focus? Will the next set of leaders, I won't put this on a prime minister because I think it's broader than that, but will the next set of leaders look to move from social cohesion in opposition to Trump to social cohesion in the good of Canada, right? Will we focus on economic growth? Will we start to build things, right, that actually find ways to bridge the gaps? And then I think you will see, right, and we don't see it quite yet because regionally it's happened, more of a regional play, right, where you actually have to bring the regions together. We have to bring some of these groups together that have been the traditional challenges with social cohesion.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I mean, one of the things we've been talking about all this week, or all last week, I should say, was the conversation around Western separatism, secessionist movements starting to foment in Canada. And, the polling data that I have so far tells me that this still remains a pretty fringe proposition. The majority of Albertans would not join America tomorrow. A strong supermajority of Albertans would not join America tomorrow. But I would note that in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, the number of people who would join are much higher than the Canadian average. I mean, the numbers are between sort of 15 and 20% in Alberta and Saskatchewan, respectively, according to the data we've done. But that's a problem. That's a problem that I think that's a signal of an issue that a future government or a future set of leaders is going to have to identify and work through.
Yeah, and that's a challenge to happen because it requires a lot of political maneuvering and a lot of larger decisions to happen. What's more likely to happen, and I think might be a bigger problem, is the quiet quitting of the country, right? So we have young people who are talented and can move on.
And they just
decide, it's not for me, Canada, right?
Right.
And you don't see that in the stats. You don't see that. It's not going to be a big movement. It'll just be a continuous steady drain, right? We already see the Institute for Canadian Citizenship runs a report called The Leaky Bucket the last couple of years. We already see newcomers coming to the country, and sort of 5 to 7 years after they've made huge steps to leave where the countries of their origin to come here, turn around saying, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, and then moving on, right? And there's, because of the way their data is collected, it's not their Stats Canada data, it's a lag. So they're looking at lags that were happening in pre-2020, And the reasons that we know those were happening was because there weren't the economic opportunities. There weren't, it wasn't that we weren't
Where
wealthy.
there was the housing.
There wasn't housing. Canada was
The quality
more
of life
welcoming.
wasn't there.
The data we have, people generally say, newcomers say, Canada's very welcoming to me, but it's not panning out, the economic opportunities.
Yeah.
So I'm almost more worried that we sort of have the equivalent of quiet quitting on the country, right? Or even people who stay but decide it's not worth becoming an entrepreneur because everything's just against me, right? So I'm just going to roll. And so you end up with this blasé view of the country where, it just becomes self-fulfilling.
Right. And then, of course, the fewer entrepreneurs, the fewer successes we have, the more people leave because they're just like, I can't make a go of it here.
Yeah.
So what you wind up is a Canada as a kind of retirement community.
Exactly, yeah. And then you hit a real economic crunch. And we know when there's really economic crunch, when people are pushed to the wall, that's where they look. It's like any team sport. You sort of look in and say, the problem is everybody in the team, some of the people in the team, right? And then you get a chance that maybe, one province decides we're better off not being part of the team.
Interesting. Okay. Well, Mike, is there anything else that you want to say about this election in particular? I mean, one of the major problems that you identified that undermines social cohesion is, of course, the use of wedge issues. I don't think we've seen a lot of wedge issues to date in this particular election, but certainly the last one we sure as hell did. And I think that led to some real damage to the country.
I think so too. And you're right. In this one, we haven't because the light between the policy of the major parties isn't a lot there, right?
The Conservatives announce something and the Liberals steal it. It's
exactly,
perfect.
Yeah. So,
everybody's on the same page.
Goes back to the Trump focus, right? But we, it's not just wedge issues during elections, right? When governments start to govern, they look for ways to talk to their community, smaller groups, et cetera. I think one of the big challenges, and this isn't a shot at any government of late, but all governments of late, is they don't do the communications around the value of government, right? They do the communications around the value of the policy they want to put forward. I think everybody who knows anything about government would say there are good things government does, but we don't communicate it very well, right? And there are bad things government does, and it tends to make the headlines. I remember being in Vancouver, speaking to a group, and I'm from Ottawa, and then that day, in the newspaper, the local government couldn't run a light rapid transit because it doesn't work in the snow. The provincial government had license plates that you couldn't see in the dark, and the federal government pay its people.
I wonder why people are skeptical about the value of government.
And people hear those and go, well, government doesn't work. So, it becomes a self-fulfilling challenge.
Interesting. Well, Mike, thanks for joining us again for this week. And we will be talking to either you or your colleague again next week on the Line. But it was lovely to have you on, and always happy to have people digging into some of the deeper issues. So thank you again.
Thanks, Jen.